Well, it's great to be with you guys here in Hong Kong. Even though I'm here virtually, boy, what an amazing place. You know, as a young boy, I had an opportunity to visit Hong Kong. You see, my father was in the U.S. Air Force, and we traveled over the Orient. And I really distinctly remember my trip to Hong Kong as a young boy. And while we were in Hong Kong, something very interesting happened. We had a chance to visit and tour this really cool boat that was in the Hong Kong harbor. It was the Queen Elizabeth. And as most of you know, it sunk actually very soon after we left. I think it was 2 days after we left. The boat sunk in kind of a famous event. So it's great to be back here with you in Hong Kong. I also want to really thank the amazing people who brought our team with you. Henry and his team have done just an amazing job preparing for this visit. What an amazing group of educators who have helped to bring this whole conference together. So can you hear it? Have you seen it? Have you felt it? I'm talking about that massive, churning, rumbling feeling beneath the feet of every educator. I'm talking about that unsettling feeling beneath your feet, that the foundation of education is shifting. And you know, it's been shifting for a long time, and in many ways, it's not new. Education has been undergoing lots of change for a long time. You know, what's not new is that the foundation has been shifting back and forth over a long time. We've been asking questions like, can all children learn? And if so, how do we teach them? We've been asking questions like, what should we teach? And how should we teach it? We've been asking questions like, how do we teach good teachers how to teach? We've been asking questions like, what should we keep and what should we fix in education? Asking the question, what's the purpose of school? In the endless parade of school reforms, which ones should we keep and what should we just let pass by? These questions have been going on for well over 100 years. But there are some things that are new. What is new in education is that there's a growing impatience for anemic results. So many people want to put their hand inside of education. There is a level of frustration that I sense amongst educators that is unprecedented. Let's be honest, our students have changed. They have changed in significant ways in the last decade, haven't they? Everyone has a voice. You as an educator have a voice. You can take to social media and say things that you could never say and amplify your voice. So can administrators, so can parents, so can students. And they have, and they are, and they will continue. That's new. That's unprecedented. Global competition, though been around for a long time, is something that we see continuing to accelerate at a rapid rate. And how can we not realize that technology that has inundated and changed this world is changing the world of education? We live in an increasingly complex world. Our educational systems are getting increasingly complex. And if there's any constant, and that constant is that there is increasing change. Our world is filled with change, my friends. What's happened in the world is it's been disrupted. You know, disruption is where the world changes. And oftentimes the people who have the old systems, they fall apart. You see, the world is changing and the future is going to be different from the past. That's true in a lot of arenas. That's been true, for example, in lighting. If you look at how lights have changed, that world has been disrupted. In telecommunications, it's been disrupted. It's been disrupted in transportation. And how we access movies, right? We used to have to go, like, you guys remember this? Go to the movie store and rent a movie. I remember old days where there's these VCR tapes. Anybody still have any of those at their house? Yeah, I bet you do. Okay. Or how we access travel. We used to go to a travel agent. Now we just do it online. Now, for those of you who are under 30, okay, I've got this next image you won't recognize. How we accessed Music back in the old day was we went to this place called a record store. That's a record store. And now, of course, we just do it on Spotify or Pandora or iTunes, don't we? The world's changed. News, how we access news has changed. How we access books and read books. What about education? Here's an image from 1917. Okay, 2017? Dude, do you realize? They look the same. Even more fascinating, if you look all over the world, what you'll find, and look at classrooms, that they look amazingly similar to each other, and they look the same way they did 100 years ago. You don't believe me? Then do what I did. Google the word classroom followed by country, and this is what you'll find. This is what a classroom looks like in the United States, in Japan, in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, in Russia, in Korea, in Pakistan, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in the Himalayan mountains, in Vietnam, in Brazil, in Iran, in rich countries, in developing countries, in the military, in prison, in business, in higher education, and yes, in Hong Kong. I have 3 questions for you. How is it that countries that so differ in language, religion, culture, politics, classrooms look kind of the same? Why is it that these classrooms look so similar to the way they did 100 years ago? And question 3, when we look at these classrooms side by side, what are we seeing? You know what we're seeing? We are seeing these classrooms where we're lining up students like widgets in a factory, pouring knowledge into their heads. That's what we're seeing. Folks, this is astounding. We're in 2017. Really? Really? Where we say 21st century learning, etc., etc. Really? We still persist in the old model. Let me prove this to you. In 2014, Dr. Robert Marzano did a study of 2 million United States classrooms from kindergarten through 12th grade, and he found that 58% of class time was what he called interacting with new content. What he meant by that is direct instruction / lecture. 36% was deepening, practicing that content, and only 6% was the cognitively complex tasks. Why is that? Why is that happening? I'm going to give you that I believe there are 3 reasons why education has not been disrupted sufficiently. Number 1, tradition. We've always done it that way before. We can't change. Now let me say this carefully. Not all traditions are bad, okay? But sometimes tradition can slow positive change. The second one is interesting, and I believe it's ego. We often say it's all about the kids. It's all about the kids. Can I say, frankly, sometimes it isn't about the kids. It oftentimes becomes about the educators, the teachers, the administrators, and their ego gets in the way and their pride, and they forget that it's about the kids. It's more of a self-protective thing. Now let me confess, I'm describing myself too here. I remember as a young teacher, one thing that I used to do was keep my students after class. And when I would keep them after class, I was telling the other teachers that my class was more important than theirs. And then one day, an older teacher, she came to me and she was upset because I kept doing this over and over again. And she said, "John, you think your class is more important than mine?" And I wanted to say, yeah, I do. My ego just got in the way, didn't it? A couple days later, I had to basically go down to her and say, "You were right and I was wrong." And I had to swallow my ego and realize that I was putting my needs first, and I was not really in the best interest really of the kids or of the whole school in general. So I believe that there's sometimes ego can really be a problem. And then the third thing is culture. I believe the culture can get away. A culture where we push people down. In fact, I would say a culture of, well, let's watch a video clip that I think that illustrates this cultural thing I see at schools.
Now that FedEx has helped us simplify our e-commerce, we can focus on bigger issues, like our passive-aggressive environment.
We're not passive-aggressive.
We're not passive-aggressive.
Hey. There are no bad suggestions here, no matter how lame they are.
Well said, Anne. I've always admired how you just say what's in your head, without thinking.
Very brave.
Good point, Ted. You're living proof that looks aren't everything.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So, FedEx helps simplify our e-commerce business, and this is not a passive-aggressive environment.
I just want to say you guys are doing a great job.
What's that supposed to mean?
So what I mean by culture is that I believe there's a passive-aggressive culture in education where we say one thing, but we really mean something else. Let's be honest. So oftentimes when the principal comes and says, hey, we're going to do this and this and this, and you all kind of smile and say, yeah. But when you go back in the back room or in the lunchroom and you're talking to your friend, the other teacher, you say, can you believe what that principal said? We don't want to do this. Or I've done this, by the way. So I believe these big three, tradition, ego, and culture, can really get in the way of education and of the change that we need. You know what we're seeing? What we're seeing in all these images is passive learning. And I don't want to spend forever trying to convince you that the key that we need to talk about is active learning. If you still believe that passive learning is the best way to learn, fine. And if you're one of those people who says, no, we need active learning, my guess is you're going to continue to just wring your hands and say, why can't people adopt a more active model? And I got breaking news for you folks. I have been traveling all over the world, almost 1 million miles in the air, traveling and sharing about how to move schools from passive learning to active learning, and the jury's out. We are at an inflection point in the history of education where if we don't change, it's going to change with us. All over the world, educators are realizing that the old model is dead. All over the world, classrooms that look like this are being replaced by classrooms that look like this. All over the world, educators who have moved and crossed the chasm from passive to active learning are saying they could never, ever go back. Talk to the people in this room who've done this, and they're going to say, I can never go back. I've heard them specifically say that. All around the world, we are realizing that the key to a quality education is active learning. And the big takeaway, my friends, is that we are undergoing a foundational shift in our educational system. We're not talking about instructional change like project-based learning or inquiry learning or cooperative learning. Though valuable they are, we're talking about something deeper, something much more seismic that's changing. And I want to tell you folks that it is time. It's time to realize that the future of education will be different from the past. It's time to realize that classrooms like this don't work anymore. It's time to realize that we are in the midst of a foundational change. It's time to change our foundation. And if we're going to change our foundation, folks, I'm going to argue that we need to build it on 3 critical pillars. The first pillar is pragmatism. This may sound odd. Pragmatism. We need things that just work. We as educators have sometimes been idealistic. We have tried to oh, this ought to work. We ought to try. We need things that just work. Number 2, we need to have plain talk. This really goes back to the ego, culture, and tradition thing we talked about a little bit ago. Read this quote. I think it's quite powerful, right? Culture of no friction means the real discussions take place in the parking lot and not the professional learning community. Isn't that not so true? Doesn't that happen? So we need to be willing to have courageous conversations with each other. And if we're not willing to have those conversations, I'm afraid we will be lost. And the third pillar may seem odd. The third pillar is I believe we need to move to the pedagogies of the past. Wait a second, did you just say pedagogies of the past, John? Aren't you talking about the future being different than the past? Yes and no. I want to distinguish between what I call the old school and the old school. The old school is the industrial model that we've been talking about in many ways. The old school is the model that was founded, if you will, by both Confucius and Socrates, who had a very different view of education. It was much more personalized, individualized, questioning, inquiry. It was more of a mentorship model. And their model is the old school. And we need to return to the old school model. Now let's take a real quick gander and see what happened historically in education. At least in the United States, what happened was in the 1800s, this man, Horace Mann, came along. And Horace was the Secretary of Education for the state of Massachusetts. And he wanted every kid to get educated. Every kid. Because in the old school, only the rich kids got educated, right? The kids were in factories and such. So he was looking for a model to teach all kids. But of course, in the 1800s in the United States, it was going through the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, of course, then helped him determine what type of a model. So this model, this industrial age model, do you realize in education has not been around for that long? It's only been around for 100 and some years. Before that, we had the old school model. But yet this model, the old school model, has permeated throughout the whole world. I mean, to illustrate even their ideas about how education should be, one of the early founders, Elwood Chubberley, said this: in schools and in a sense factories in which the raw products, the children, are to be shaped and fashioned into the products to meet the various demands of life. They were treating students as widgets in a factory, trying to pour knowledge into their heads. I got news! We don't live in the industrial era anymore. We do not live in the Industrial Revolution. We need students who can collaborate, who can think, who can problem solve. We need a whole different type of a student today. We don't need students to just work in factories anymore. So yes, people, we need to return to the old school, to the pedagogies of the past. We need to find a way to scale the Confucius and the Socratic model. We need to find a way to get away from the one-size-fits-all education model. We need to stop treating students like widgets in a factory. To help us understand this, let's cut to a video clip. And this video clip is going to serve as a metaphor for the rest of our talk.
In Connecticut, as many as 30,000 homes are facing an issue so serious that the governor wants FEMA to declare it a natural disaster. And the effects could cost up to $1 billion. Homeowners are watching their concrete basement walls crumble, putting their houses at risk of collapse, and in what could be a wake-up call for people everywhere.
Oh, my God.
And this has probably happened in the past year.
The middle of the night sounds were the walls of the basement splitting.
You can see outside.
In some places, wide open.
Maggie, are you worried tonight the house is going to come down on top of you?
I do. I worry. I do worry.
How do you sleep?
Some nights it's hard.
There is a fix, lifting the home completely off the foundation and pouring a new one. For the Paracchios, who raised 4 children here, the price tag is more than $200,000, nearly 60% the value of their home. On top of the emotional pain, this family and many like them face financial ruin, and there's little hope of a quick solution. Stephanie Gosk, NBC News, Willington, Connecticut.
Don't you see in this clip that 30 years ago, 20 years ago, they poured the foundation of these homes. And the problem was that in the concrete, there was a problem. There was an impurity that after 20 years, the foundation started to crumble. Let's use this as a metaphor for our conversation. Think of it this way. When we poured the foundation for education 100 and some odd years ago, in the Industrial Revolution model, it was destined to crumble and fall apart. And I think what's happening now is it's crumbling and falling apart. But what we've been doing is we've been spending our time dressing up upstairs. We've been painting the living room. We've been putting new countertops in the kitchen. We've been buying new furniture. But meanwhile, the foundation underneath our house is crumbling. And it's going to crash and burn if we don't do something about it. So if indeed this premise is true, that our foundation is crumbling, what should be in the new foundation? I'm going to argue that there are 6 pillars that need to go into this foundation. Number 1, it should support mass personalization at scale. Number 2, it should prepare students for the uncertain future versus the rapidly disappearing past. Number 3, it should be flexible enough to deal with the rapid and consistent change. Number 4, it should allow us to keep what works and throw out what doesn't. Number 5, it should be based on active learning that encourages students to take more ownership of their education. And lastly, it should support the development of world-class learners and world-class teachers. I've got some good news for you. Do you realize a model that fits these 6 things that already exists? It already exists, and it's called flipped learning. Now, a lot of people think they know what flipped learning is. They think, oh, that's that thing with the videos. It's all about the videos of video. That's not true. A real quick primer on flipped learning. You know, think about Bloom's taxonomy. In most classrooms across the world, Dr. Marzano talked about this earlier, right? That most of class time is spent at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy doing information transfer, teaching students about knowledge and understanding, giving them the stuff. And then we send them home to apply and analyze and evaluate. But of course, on flipped learning, we flip Bloom's taxonomy upside down. We spend less class time on knowledge transfer, the knowledge and understanding stages of Bloom's taxonomy, and more class time on the upper reaches of Bloom's. In fact, as we've thought more deeply about Bloom's taxonomy, we realize the actual best picture of Bloom's taxonomy is the diamond shape here, where you spend the vast majority of your time in the middle of Bloom's taxonomy, doing application and analysis. Those are what we need to be doing in our class time. Now, hear me carefully. I'm not saying we should get rid of knowledge transfer. You can't apply something you know nothing about. But you see, flipped learning repurposes and asks the question, what's the best use of your face-to-face class time? And the answer is, from Bloom's taxonomy, the middle or the upper parts of Bloom's. And we can use the, as we like to say, the individual space for the lower levels of Bloom's. This model exists and has existed for over a decade and continues to show promise and show that it works. And in fact, I would argue it is the future of education. And you might even think of it this way. It's like the easy button. It's the easy way to move from passive to active learning. There are other ways to move from passive to active learning, but flipped learning is the easy button. Do you need an easy way to get to the active learning? Flipped. This past year, a small, dedicated group of educators got together to really rethink flipped learning. And we discovered some things, 5 things that we didn't know. You know, as I talk about these 5 things we didn't know, I need to make a confession. You know, I'm one of the pioneers of flipped learning, and these 5 things that I didn't know, sometimes we can get clouded. I think this quote from Paul Getty said, "In times of rapid change, experience can be your worst enemy." And I believe that I jumped into that. I had that problem. So let's talk about the 5 things we learned over the past year. Number 1, flipped learning is not static. You see, there is a static view of flipped learning. That flipped learning is that thing, as I said earlier, it's all about the videos. We hear quotes like this. I know all about flipped classrooms. I read John and Aaron's first book and attended a conference session. But what we found was astounding is that flipped learning is not static, but is dynamic and changing rapidly. So number 1, flipped learning is not static. Number 2, flipped learning is evolving because of 3 factors. So let's look at those 3 factors. Number 1 is research. Number 2 is classroom innovation. And number 3 is technology. So let's look at the first one. Research. Do you realize that the number of research articles coming out on flipped learning is exponentially increasing? One of the research fellows, Dr. Robert Talbert, from the Flipped Learning Global Initiative, our organization, has come up with, has graphed this and says, wow, it's amazing what they're doing. Number 2, we're discovering that in the flipped, if you will, 1.0 era, the questions that were being asked were, student scores going up? The answer is yes. Are teachers happy? Yes. Are students happy? Yes. But now the questions are basically much deeper, like how do we make flipped learning better? Dr. Gojin, another one of the research fellows at FLGI, he said, ask this question. Instead of asking the question, does it work? Because he says, yeah, it does work. We should be asking the question, how do we make the model better? And that is indeed what is happening. The second thing we're seeing is classroom innovation. You see, the key to flipped learning isn't what happens in the individual space, if you will, the flipped videos or the flipped reading assignments, but what happens in the class time. And what we're seeing is crazy cool stuff in innovation with how students are doing videos themselves of their learning, student-created videos, about exploring the group space beyond the classroom walls, where students are connecting with other students across the world. We're seeing innovations in how they collaborate, how the educators are collaborating with each other to become the best that they can. We're seeing innovations in how teachers and students relate with each other. This is one of the things that has really been the most astounding. And actually, this is something we've known for a long time, but flipped learning kind of couples what I believe are the two key things. Active learning, we've been talking about quite a bit. But the second thing is relationships. What we're finding is that relationships are increased and better in a flipped environment because, of course, the teacher has more time to devote to class. And the third one is technology. Technology, how can we argue, is rapidly changing the world. And we used to be in the sort of the early adopter stage in technology. Well, we're way past that now, folks. Technology has inundated virtually every school on the planet. And there's even new breeds of learning management systems that are beginning to emerge around the idea of flipped learning. In fact, there's a bunch of companies who've come around our organization, the Flipped Learning Global Initiative, to develop the best-in-class, world-class products for flipped learning. So yes, there are three big factors: research, classroom innovation, and technology. So to review, number one, flipped learning is not static. Number two, flipped learning is evolving because of three factors. And number three, flipped learning is emerging as a global movement. Even the number of searches for the term flipped classroom on Google has exponentially increased over the years. And we're finding flipped learning happening on every continent, in countries as diverse as you can imagine. We have one of our master teachers is from Iran. We've got master teachers from Brazil and from Taiwan, and all over the world we are seeing China. All over the world, an amazing amount of flipped learning happening. In fact, we're 6 key hotspots. Do you realize in Australia it's becoming a part of the national curriculum? Okay, in Spain, the Ministry of Education sponsored FlipCon Spain. Some of you are here at FlipCon event here in Hong Kong. Argentina. Amazing story is that one of the provinces, Misiones, is flipping the entire province with like 300,000 students. An amazing thing. And doing that in a very poor place where there's not a lot of access to technology. What they're doing is just astounding. And in Taiwan and China, now multinational companies are vying for market share because they realize that there's actually a lot of opportunity from a business perspective. In fact, it's estimated that flipped learning is growing at 37% every year. Every year, my friends. So number one, flipped learning is not static. Number two, flipped learning is evolving because of three factors. Number three, it's emerged as a global movement. Number four, it's presented new opportunities. New opportunities. Think of it this way. There's like a help wanted sign. You see, what's happening is that people are looking for trained flipped learning teachers. So if you're a trained flipped learning teacher, you've got a better chance of getting a job. Also, flipped learning principals and administrators who can lead their school through flipped learning, a need for flipped learning trainers, a need for flipped learning researchers, a need for flipped learning authors and speakers. In fact, at our organization, the Flipped Learning Global Initiative, a number of our professors have written books on the subject of flipped learning. We have some more books coming out, and here's some other books that we have that are doing some amazing, amazing things. So there's this huge need. So maybe you're an author, maybe you're a speaker, maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're an administrator. You are looking to up your resume. So number one, flipped learning is not static. Number two, flipped learning is evolving because of three factors. Number three, it's the global movement. Number four, there's a help wanted sign. And number five, most important, this is the most important finding. This is the thing that we were most surprised about. And if you don't get anything out of this, this is the key I think you want to understand. So we've discovered that flipped learning is emerging as a meta strategy that supports all. This is the key statement. Flipped learning is not just another teaching strategy, but rather a meta strategy that supports all others. Let me say it again. A meta teaching strategy that supports all others. Let me illustrate it this way. If you think about sort of the plethora of different ways that we could teach class, cooperative learning, project-based learning, inquiry learning, flipped learning, or whatever, we oftentimes think of them as just, hey, I do this or I do this. They think of them in buckets. But what I think the better picture is that we need to say flipped learning is the new foundation. To go back to our analogy, the new foundation that leads to all others. It's the meta strategy that supports all others. To switch metaphors, let's go back to Robert Talbert. You recall Robert, we talked with him earlier, shared about his stuff. He likes to use this metaphor. He says, think of flipped learning as the operating system, okay? And all these other teaching methodologies are apps. So my phone, for example, is iOS. That's the operating system. But I do use apps. The phone isn't very useful without the apps, but it's totally worthless without the operating system. So flipped learning is the meta strategy that supports all others. You know, what we're seeing is practical significance all over the world. It's not new. Some people, is this new? It's been around for 10, 11 years now, really. It's happening in diverse subjects. We're seeing this in law, in medicine, in science, in engineering, in business, in pottery. We're seeing it everywhere. Some of the major institutions of the world are using flipped learning. Do you realize that Harvard Medical School has flipped? Harvard Medical School. So we are seeing this happening everywhere all the time. And the research, the data, the experiences are indicating that flipped learning is indeed, my friends, the new foundation, the new operating system that we need to work under. This past year, a friend of mine asked me 5 critical questions that really cut to my heart. Let me share those questions with you. The first question, he says, if flipped learning is so great, why isn't everyone flipping their classrooms? You know, you can go to the United States, and I bet you can't hardly find any school where there isn't 1 or 2 or 3 teachers who are flipping their classes. But if indeed what we're saying is true, and there's so much passive learning going on, why are we allowing this to happen? Number 2, why are we accepting, I just said this, why are we accepting passive learning in any school when we know there's a better way? We know that it's not creating self-directed, world-class learners. Number 3, why are we encouraging or enabling students to avoid owning their own learning and setting them up to be ill-prepared for the demands of the future? Number 4, why should we allow tradition, ego, school culture, or conflict avoidance to override what we know is what's best for students? And maybe the hardest one is, why are we being casual about what any other profession might consider malpractice? This led me to a crisis in my own professional life. I realized that I've been focusing on flipping lessons and not flipping schools. There's a time now to move and scale this up because it's what is best for students. Well, let's make this more personal for you. I don't know if you've got kids, but I do. I happen to have 3 amazing kids. In fact, I guess I could say I have 4 kids because my son is now married, and an amazing wife, the love of my life. And they're all in school. University now. But as they're in school, is it okay? Would I be okay if their teacher was teaching passively? Am I okay with them getting a subpar education? No, no, no. Are you? I imagine many of you have your own children. Are you okay if your kid goes to a school that isn't good? Where they're using models and modes that don't work? I bet you aren't. I'm reminded of the medical term, do no harm. Is it ever acceptable for a doctor to use an old method of treatment when there's a better way? Is it ever acceptable that when a third world dentist discovers a new way to treat teeth, instead of pulling them, they could fill the cavities? Is it ever acceptable to them to just pull the teeth? No. When doctors, dentists do this, we call that malpractice. Let's use a story. In 1601, James Lancaster had 4 boats, and they left London, and they were on their way to India. And on their way, he did an experiment, a very famous experiment. On his boat, everybody got 3 sips of lime juice every day. On the other boats, no sips of lime juice. You may know the story. In his boat, nobody died. On the other boats, 110 people died. As we now know, medically, this was scurvy was a problem, and the people would die with lack of vitamin C, and the limes had vitamin C in it. And people talk about this as the awesome thing, but do you realize this is the sad ending of this story? He discovered this in 1601, but in the British Navy, it took 194 years. 194 years before it became standard practice for people to take an extra vitamin C via like limes. And it's estimated that 1 million, that's right, 1 million people died in those 194 years, sailors, while this was not being used. They did not adopt. There was a better way, and they didn't adopt it for a long, long time. Do we want to be, as educators, like that? Do we want to wait 194 years and do damage? You might say, John, that's being overly dramatic. You're talking about the, medicine, you're talking about the lives of people. But you know what, in education, we're talking about the lives of our kids. Our kids matter, okay? And if we give them a subpar education, we are destroying, in many cases, their chances for success. We are committing educational malpractice. We need to realize that classrooms that look like this need to go away. And we need to replace them with the classrooms that look like this. My friends, it's time. It's time. It's time. It's time to realize that the future of education needs to be different from the past. It's time to realize that what used to be impossible is now possible. It's time to realize that we need a new foundation in our educational system. Now, I know I'm talking to some of the most amazing, sharp educators in all of Hong Kong. You guys came here to this session taking valuable time out of your life. You guys are amazing. So you're the leading educators in Hong Kong. And so I know that you get this and you believe in this, and it's the other people who need some help. And that's true. But can I say this to you guys? I want you to expand your vision, because you're probably saying, all right, I get it, John. All right, I'm motivated. Where do I start? Okay, I'm going to give you 8 things that you can do so that you can move from passive to active learning. So maybe you flipped one class, then you can flip more. Maybe you just only flipped a few lessons, you can flip more. There's a lot of things that you can do. Here's the 8 things I'll say. Number 1, get the best flipped training. We estimate that 90% of the flipped training is 5 to 7 years behind. They're in the Flip Learning 1.0 era and not the Flip Learning 3.0 era. You need to find the simplest technologies. Number 3, you need to find the solutions that are common to the flippers. Number 4, you need to get out of the silos. This is a problem we've discovered. There's a lot of people, they get a sort of a small view of flipped learning and they start doing stuff, and a lot of it's okay, but then right around the corner, there's something else that's very exciting that's happening. I think this is the elephant in the classroom. So many people get isolated. In this world where social media and whatnot is so rampant, why are we living in our own little bubbles? You see this, the blind person's view of flipped learning. Some people think it's about the videos. They have all these different views and they need to get out and get the big picture. Number 5, you need to keep up with the best global flipped practices, right? That's similar to what we just talked about a minute ago. Number 6, you need to validate your flipped knowledge through certification. Now, the good news is that many of you are now enrolled in our Flip certification program, and that is amazing, and what you're going to learn is going to just put you at the top of the world in flipped learning. And then build your own flipped learning resume. If you want another job and you think flipped learning will get you there, because it is. I can tell you story after story. I had a principal a while back. He said, I'm looking for some teachers who flipped. Send them my way, I'll hire them. Boy, that's happening all over the world. And then you need to share your expertise with the global community. I want to say this carefully. We've got a group at flglobal.org/community, free group. I want you to join. There's amazing conversations happening there. Jump in, learn, contribute. This is how you can connect and not live in those silos. Walls may be going up on the southern border of the United States, but walls are going down all over the world of education. We live in the most exciting times in the history of education. This is the inflection point, my friends. And folks, it's time. It's time that we realize that passive learning doesn't work. Active learning is the future of education, and flipped learning is the easy button to get there. But it's going to take courage. It's going to take courage on your part to make that difference. I think, honestly, that Confucius maybe have said it best when he said, to see what is right and not do it is a lack of courage. I encourage you to be courageous, to realize that the future of education will be different from the past, to realize that you can make the difference. You, the amazing, amazing educators from Hong Kong, can be the ones to make the difference. You, my friends, be courageous. Thank you very much.